Oh hey, what's up? It's the man behind the camera, the cult personality, Young Richey here, to teach you everything you need to know about Eisenhower. So we're going to talk about Ike. That was his nickname, as he personified the 1950s in America. It's enough. So, to learn more about his rise, you first have to know about Truman's fall. So, political scandals, a desire for relief from the Korean War, and also just a lack of enthusiasm led Truman to not seek a second term in 1952. Instead, Democrats opted for Governor Adlai Stevenson. On the other side, you had Republicans, the old guard establishment, led by Robert Taft, against the sort of moderate wing of the Republican Party, in this case led by Dwight Eisenhower. So Eisenhower won the nomination, of course, and he chose as his VP candidate a fiery young conservative by the name of Richard Nixon, who made himself quite popular during the Alger Hiss case, which investigated communism and its effects on American society and its infiltration in the American government. So in 1952, Eisenhower had a landslide victory, as you can see here. And so he came to office, and so he was quite a consequential president. And let's first talk about his domestic policy. So, Dwight Eisenhower was a fiscal conservative, as he believed in the importance of balancing the budget. In fact, all of his budgets were either balanced or close to being balanced. And so, on other issues on the domestic side, he was kind of moderate. He continued FDR's New Deal programs, and in fact, expanded on a few of them. Increasing Social Security benefits, as well as raising the minimum wage. He also created the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and appointed the first woman under Republican cabinet, Oveta Cope Hubby, as you can see here. Alright, Dwight Eisenhower also was a helper of farmers in this new post-war economy, and his most well-known achievement is the Interstate Highway Act of 1956. And this basically created the interstate system as we know it today, something that we sort of take for granted, but we could not live without. So this highway system can be compared to the rise of the railroads in the 19th century as sort of expanding on the national economy and creating a homogeneous national culture. As you can see here by these stats right next to me, Eisenhower presided over the greatest, or one of the greatest economic expansions in American history. U.S. per capita income more than tripled between 1945 and 1960. The average U.S. family had twice the real income in the 1950s as they did in the 1920s. It was in this period that the U.S. standard of living became #1 in the world and continued to pretty much stay there among large industrialized countries. And then these amazing economic conditions resulted in another landslide victory in 1956, also against Adlai Stevenson. So Eisenhower was 2 for 2 against Stevenson. As the Cold War grabbed America's eyes abroad, it also grabbed America's eyes with respect to injustices at home. As we see, the rise of the modern civil rights movement is in the 1950s. So the 1953 Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, desegregated public schools in a substantial victory for the civil rights cause. This resulted in the ending of the dictum of separate but equal, established by Plessy v. Ferguson. However, it also resulted in what was known as the Southern Manifesto, basically a document where mostly Southern Democrats expressed disapproval and sought ways to end such a decision or bypass a decision. And an example of this, in 1956, Governor Orval Faubus of Arkansas used the National Guard to prevent African American teenagers from attending a public high school. Eisenhower had to intervene, and he sent basically the U.S. Army there to escort these teens into the public high school, as you can see here. Another example of this fiery up-and-coming movement is the Rosa Parks incident, which then resulted in the Montgomery bus boycott. And again, these were all non-violent ways of protest that no matter what, they still angered many Southern Democrats, because Southern Democrats generally were in favor of segregation at this time. As for Eisenhower and his contribution to the movement, he was not as keen on radical changes, but he did help a little bit. He passed the Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960, which were the first major civil rights acts since Reconstruction to be passed. So he did help there with incremental movements. They established a permanent civil rights commission, gave the new Department of Justice new powers to handle civil rights cases. And although these are, as I said, modest steps, they were still necessary steps in the fight for true civil rights. Also, we see the rise of Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a major player in the civil rights movement, as it sort of gathered other, civil rights activists. All right, let's move to foreign policy. So Eisenhower basically turned the airport into a real thing by appointing John Foster Dulles as his Secretary of State. So with him came the idea of brinksmanship. This is a term you have to know. Brinksmanship is basically going to the brink of war without actually going to war, without actually firing weapons. And this time would be nuclear weapons. So being very aggressive, but not exactly going to war with the Soviet Union. Instead, there were proxy conflicts. So in Eisenhower's administration, the CIA had many covert operations to sort of take out any instances of leftism or communism. In Iran in 1953, in Guatemala in 1958, and in Indonesia Guatemala in 1954, Indonesia in 1958. And during his administration, Eisenhower also visited Korea and agreed to the Korean Armistice in 1953. Now, during this time, you also had the rise of a problem in Vietnam. So, basically, during the 1950s, you had a nationalist communist revolution led by Ho Chi Minh, and they basically were able to take out the French colonizers. As you may or may not know, or you should know, France had a colony in Indochina that included Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, countries like that, Southeast Asia. So basically, Vietnam was split in 1954 between the North, which were communists, and the South, which were pro-America capitalists, so similar to the Korean Peninsula. And basically, in this time, Eisenhower sent a lot of aid in both monetary funds as well as soldiers, because he believed in what was known as the domino effect. Basically, this would be an addendum to the Truman Doctrine of containment. Basically, if one country becomes communist, then others become communist, so you have to intervene, and that was a justification. So let's go to the Middle East. So basically, in the Middle East, the one major conflict you have to know during this time is that of the Suez Crisis. So basically, the nationalist leader of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, tried to nationalize the Suez Canal, but it was owned by Britain and France at this time. And so Israel also was an enemy of many Arab nations at this time, and so they thought that nationalization of the Suez Canal would cut off trade and much needed supplies to Israel. So Britain, France, and Israel came and they attacked Egypt out of Nasser's promise to nationalize it. So as for Egypt, Egypt went to the U.S. for support for the canal, for nationalizing. The U.S. said no. But then the Soviet Union sort of agreed and sort of created a friendship with Egypt. But after this friendship with the Soviet Union, then the U.S. was like, okay, we actually have to, handle this situation. We have to help Egypt. And so Eisenhower basically told off the Israelis, the French, and the British, and went to the UN and condemned this attack on Egypt for the nationalization of the canal. And this policy would be known as the Eisenhower Doctrine. Generally in the Middle East, he would give aid in terms of, again, money and troops in the case of any fears of leftism or communism. As we saw, Egypt was sort of getting a little cozy with Soviet Union, and despite the allies of the U.S. on the other side, Eisenhower still went with Egypt and the anti-communist stance. So we see we have a meme here of Nasser. We have the ships that are gonna attack. So, however, his stance was not always utilized throughout the world. In 1956, there's a revolution in Hungary led by Imre Nagy, I believe. That's how you pronounce it. I'm sorry if I pronounced it incorrectly. However, this was crushed easily by the Soviet Union. Eisenhower didn't really help him. And one could say it was probably a good choice. He did not want to start an actual hot war with the Soviet Union. And closer back home, we have the rise of Fidel Castro in 1959. And that sort of made Americans uneasy. They thought, he was not cool. Right? And so that would result in an invasion, which we'll talk about next time. Alright, so overall, Eisenhower's legacy is that of economic prosperity, incremental civil rights, but still substantial improvements, as well as a strong American foreign policy and overall decisive leadership. He's followed by John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter, which will round out the end of Period 8 for our videos. And these are also some very consequential presidents, but generally when people look to a modern prosperity, people look to the Eisenhower years, even though it was not all great for women and again African Americans in general. It was still getting a lot better, but slowly. As we see here, these are next presidents to come in the next video, and I am Young Richey, and I'm signing off.